Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to start the next panel. I'm joined by two extremely distinguished ladies. The Kanayo Awani, who's the Executive Vice President of the Intra-African Trade Bank, Afreximbank, and Diana Layfield, who is the Chair of British International Investments, previously known as CDC. I'm sure you're trying to get away from CDC, Diana, but new branding, BII. So thank you both very much for being here today. We appreciate your time. And Kanayo, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Afreximbank has made a huge, significant, progressive leap in the last decade. And there may be some people in the room who are not, they remember Afreximbank for being a trade finance bank, and you've moved well beyond that into infrastructure financing. And I think it would be helpful for everybody just to understand in a little bit more detail what Afreximbank's focus is today and going forward for the next period, and some of the infrastructure financing that you're trying to deliver for Africa.
No, thank you. Let me thank you, Karen, yourself, Invest Africa, for having us and to be part of this debate. When people ask that questions about being a trade finance bank, I assume they're talking about trade in commodities. Afreximbank was set up, its primary mandate was to promote, finance, and facilitate intra- and extra-African trade, short, medium, and long term. But we had to move away from the perception of doing commodity trading because that would condemn us to the characteristics and direction of trade, which is to continue to export commodities and natural resources in their raw form, and extra-African. Even our trade routes are legacies of our past. About 10 years ago, we decided to reverse engineer that strategy. We realized that the vulnerability of our continent in trade and investments and even climate is because of external reliance and dependence on the goods that we need. Just think about COVID and how we had to, the supply chain disruptions, we had to import things like masks, face masks, rudimentary things, basic stuff from outside the continent. At the same time, the African Continental Free Trade, there had been a lot of political enthusiasm and programs that were coming on stream, starting from boosting intra-African trade to Agenda 2063, the Africa We Want, which had a continental free trade area as its flagship. Staying where we were was not an option. We had to focus and drive a change in strategy to focus on intra-African trade. Focus on intra-African trade means that you must focus on industrialization. Africa is rich in natural resources. We cannot sell crude oil to ourselves. We cannot sell cocoa to ourselves. We cannot sell tea to ourselves. Somebody must do something about industrializing for us to sell to ourselves. Our trade routes also were all directed towards extra-African trade. And we had to do something about it. Intra-African trade in itself does not have financing as its major, most important challenge. There was also issues about trade and market information. Africans don't know what their neighbors are producing or selling, or even what the rules of trade are. Infrastructure is a big challenge. Payments and multiplicity of currencies are a big challenge. Small island countries and land-linked countries are a big challenge. I already talked about infrastructure deficit, informality of trade. I think it was Gagan that talked about huge informality of trade. There were challenges. And we decided that we needed to do something about it. And that's why we, in 2016 or 2017, if my memory serves me, what we called it, we developed an enterprise strategy called Africa Transformed, Agenda 20, Impact 2026, Africa 2021, Africa Transformed. In 2022, we built on it again on another enterprise strategy, and it's hinged on 4 pillars. But I'll talk about the 3 main ones, which are, the fourth one is internal to us, is to promote intra-African trade and support the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Areas. One. The second one is to support industrialization and export development, naturally, based on the context I just provided. And the other is to deepen trade finance leadership. It was clear to us that it is Africa that will develop Africa in the main. And of course, with the development partners like BII and others who are friends of Africa, it was clear to us, and we need to do that. If you want to promote intra-African trade, it means that you have to work on infrastructure, you know. And the trade we do is not just trade in goods, services, but also trade enabling. So ports, roads, trade enabling infrastructure. And sometimes also, people think we're just doing infrastructure. Sometimes it's also to promote intra-African services. A lot of the projects we do in roads in Côte d'Ivoire and Guinea and elsewhere are Africans exporting their services, construction services. Egyptians exporting construction, EPC services to other African countries.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. Diana, can I come to you? I think most people in the hall will know what BII is about. But again, in a different way, but BII have made huge and significant progress in the last period. I don't want to be too specific, I don't want to be about that. But I think one of the aspects that perhaps people won't be aware of is your enabling and facilitation for mobilizing additional finance in parallel to the finance that you're investing. And I think there are a significant number of people in the hall who would like to understand a little bit more about BII's role in the mobilization of finance for Africa.
Sure. So first of all, I hope you know BII as the UK's development finance institution. I think what makes BII different is a couple of things that are relevant here. The first is, as we deploy more than $2 billion of capital each year, we are far more indexed towards Africa than most DFIs around the world. So over 60% of BII's portfolio is invested in Africa. And I think we do riskier things in riskier places with riskier instruments. So we do equity in areas where many DFIs only provide debt. In terms of mobilization, and that is in some ways why we're here today, working in partnership with other investors in Africa is absolutely critical. And I think what you heard from the first panel is risk is misperceived in Africa, largely because a lot of the people trying to assess that risk don't have deep experience in the continent. And so for BII, it's critical to partner with groups and institutions, founders, and companies that are deeply rooted in Africa, understand the environment, and are fundamentally African in nature, but also help to mobilize international capital, not just ours and others, but into those spaces. And I think we're going to talk about climate in a second, and that's an area where I think it's critical to have that combination of DFI capital, private sector capital, local capital, and international capital.
Thank you. Before we go drill down into some of the specifics, can I just ask you both the same question, which is, how do you determine the social impact of the funding that you're deploying, either in infrastructure, in Afreximbank's case, or in the range of sectors that you focus on?
Well, one of the things as a development finance institution is that development impact is very important for us. Where is there additionality in every project? Before we even start assessing the transaction, that's one of the few things we get in data on, the trade development impact assessment. To be sure that we're actually adding additionality, we are complementing and not supplanting existing financing in doing that. I talked about intra-African trade strategy itself, because we have a dedicated intra-African trade strategy, has a pillar where we're deliberate about measuring our impact. So, for instance, one of the things we've done right now, I mentioned the informality of trade and the huge informal trade. People will tell you that intra-African trade is about 16, 18%, depending on whose statistic you're looking at. But indeed, we know it's more. It could be as much as 35, 40%. And one of the things we've done working with UNECA is to see how we can create a baseline for measuring intra-African trade and informal intra-African trade. We're piloting that in the West African corridor. We started with Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and we've extended it to the rest of the, to measure our impact, the measure of impact in terms of also formalizing intra-African trade. The other thing we also did, and let me talk about it right now, is which we knew will help also deal with those issues, is a payment system. Because even though there's a lot of pressure on the US dollar, a lot of another local currencies to buy foreign currency, there's also a lot of trade that's being done using local currencies. Within the West African UEMOA zone, Francophone West Africa, the CFA is being used, same with Central Africa, right? That may not be captured easily because of how the trade data is captured. So we introduced PAPS. The Pan-African Payment and Settlement System is one of those. It is first to reduce reliance on foreign exchange and foreign currencies, and also to deal with the informality of trade by ensuring that goods are traded and paid for in local currencies. For instance, an Egyptian that is selling to Kenya will receive Egyptian pounds, and the Kenyan importer will pay Kenyan shillings. And that's also being piloted within the, started being piloted within the West African Monetary Zone. But right now we have about 13 central banks that have signed on across. We're now connecting the switches of other central banks that are across the continent. One of the things, again, about measurement that we've done, we introduced, using a research program or sabbatical program, baseline methodology for tracking African direct investments in the context of intra-African trade and investments. So ADIs, as we call them now, is, because you see there's a lot of information about how to track foreign direct investments, but there are really a lot of Africans who are deliberate about, just as I mentioned in the EPC space, who are deliberate about investing in Africa. How are we tracking those investments? But overall, just to conclude and not to dominate the conversation, development impact is important to us. We issued a publication recently on the Dangote refinery. It's published, where I think we're the largest single lender to that refinery and the entire petrochemical complex as well, you know, to deal with that impact, to assess that impact, you know, on that refinery. We do one again, you know, in several places across the continent, you know, because I mentioned that we collect the data up front and then we measure it afterwards.
Thank you. Diana, can I ask you the same question, the importance of social impact in the investment decisions that you're making, and also to ensure that perhaps in certain circumstances, those you're co-investing in have the same vision of the social impact that you have?
Absolutely. So clearly impact is critical for us as an impact investor. And as we are, as Andrew said, patient capital. So impact is the primary thing we assess. We assess it through a fairly sophisticated impact score. But we exist to drive inclusive, sustainable economic development. So what our score does is seek to ensure that anything we invest in does create growth that is inclusive, that provides jobs, that has the right impact on communities, is sustainable in both senses of the world, both from a kind of Paris-aligned and a climate perspective, and that it drives growth. And perhaps it's helpful to give you a couple of examples of projects there to sort of think about that. So in the climate space, we're investing in a project called Planet Solar in Sierra Leone, together with FMO and Proparco. So investing jointly 25 million in equity, which is about half the equity in the project. That project will create solar energy for Sierra Leone. It will increase the power available to the grid by 30% for the whole country. And we also believe, as well as the impact it has on development, on communities, it will also catalyze the IPP market in that space for the country. Another example would be Matito. So this is working with Matito, a Middle Eastern utility company, on water. We talk a lot about power. Power is critical, but water is also critical in the African continent. And that will look at building sustainable water facilities across the continent, starting with Rwanda, starting with Kigali, but essentially looking at water treatment facilities and water infrastructure. So again, there, it's creating opportunities that do all of those three things. In terms of how we work with our partners, I think the first is we invest in projects that will deliver on those initiatives, and we invest in projects where they're not necessarily commercially viable from the start. So if our finance isn't additional, then we don't need to do it. If something's immediately commercially spectacular for everyone, you don't need our financing there. And I think in those projects, we have a series of criteria and a series of agreements, both with the people who are developing those projects, with anyone else involved, and with our funding partners to ensure that we have aligned values and incentives there.
Thank you. And can we move slightly on to talk about finance, climate finance and energy finance, sort of wrapped up with that? And Diana, if I could just stay with you for a moment. There's a really rather embarrassingly small number of transactions that were closed in the real energy space in Africa last year. I wondered what you thought could be done to both accelerate and enhance that number, and also enhance the scale of the transactions that have been concluded.
Well, so I think we know the need is there. I think, your opening comments and panels highlighted the need both from a power perspective, but also from a climate perspective. The opportunity is clearly there. Whether it's hydro, whether it's solar, Africa has some of the best renewable energy opportunities in the world. I think the challenges have been to structure bankable projects. And as you say, there were only 8 renewable projects closed in the whole continent last year. Over the last few years, Africa's seen only 3% of global climate flows, and sub-Saharan Africa is about 1%. So there's a really big gap. How do we plug that gap? I think better awareness is critical, and events like this are good. Improving risk understanding. I think earlier panelists touched on the difference between people who really understand how to build, deliver, and operate in the continent from people who don't. So making sure that investment goes into those projects with those kind of partners that have deep local experience. I think the third is better partnership. I know Gagan was saying that there isn't money needed from outside, but actually it is critical in this space that we bring money from multiple places, and we work together in 2 senses. Bringing in those local players who really know the market, and driving that international collaboration across different institutions. Too often it's a very narrow group involved. Broadening that group, I think, would be hugely important. Better preparation. So there's some project preparation discipline that I think many people in this room are familiar with, that we can bring, so that rather than just looking at projects at the point where they want to close investment, we actually work with those teams from the first idea to really create properly prepared projects, and leveraging concessional capital to do that. That's one of the things that as a DFI, and in common with other DFIs, we can do to help bring those projects to the right level of preparation. And the last, as you said, is really making sure that we can mobilize much larger scale international capital around those opportunities.
Thank you. Kanayo, can I ask you to, you've got a very interesting project going on in Kenya at the moment, where you're working with the Kenyan government to have a climate adaptation mechanism. I think it'd be very interesting to know a little bit more about that, where you've got to in that, whether there are opportunities for other finance partners to come in alongside you to build capacity, and what that exactly involves and the impact that you hope it might have.
But before I answer that question, and so that I don't forget, well, I'm glad, it was music to my ears that you're also involved in project preparation, because we are as well. We consider ourselves some sort of financial supermarket. We're in project preparation. We're also doing project finance as well as other instruments of financing. So we have a pipeline of $6 billion of project preparation, and some of it is, in fact, maybe half of that will be in renewables and climate financing. Also, I'm just hoping that we can start that partnership right here. We also have introduced a concessional financing window about 2 years ago, with an envelope targeted at about $1 billion, just again to see how we can support, African projects. And it's open, and we'd like to talk to you about that afterwards.
Absolutely.
So I thought I should highlight that.
Perfect.
And your Kenyan project.
Yes. And of course, for us, climate financing is also about balance. I often ask ourselves, what does What does it mean for a child in rural Burkina Faso who is studying, and I just use that country, who is reading with bush lamps? It's a poignant question, but so it's all about balance and transition. And one of the things we're doing is focusing on adaptation in that space. And you're right, sometime this year, we also supported, as we're making our forays into the Caribbean that has similar characteristics as Africa. In St. Lucia, we supported them with a climate adaptation facility as well, because they're also vulnerable as Africa in the climate issues. In Kenya, we're working on the question you asked on a $700 million facility. There's plenty of opportunity for people to come in. As with financing of these things, which is actually to develop 200 irrigation dams in Kenya to deal with their own vulnerability around droughts and the food insecurity issues that emerging from the drought situation in Kenya. It's still being developed right now, and indeed is going to be syndicated as well.
We're running out of time, but I just want to get one more key question in. So pithy answers, ladies, if you can. Obviously, a very important component part of the renewable story and expansion is the access to critical minerals. And obviously, a lot of those critical minerals are in Africa in the supply chain, and we want to make sure that Africa benefits as well as everywhere else. So are you working on making sure that the critical minerals are a key part of the access to the renewable sector that we've been talking about and the financing that goes with that?
No, it will have to be.
Kanayo, yeah.
One of our initiatives is the battery precursor program in DRC and Zambia, working with UNECA and other partners to ensure that our minerals also serve the purpose deal with issues of, and basically it also speaks to what was said earlier. We need to use our critical minerals, use them and are beneficiated in the countries where they are produced or on the continent, whatever they use. We also have a hub and spoke model. For instance, in our automotive strategy, we do know that if you left every African country, they will want to have a manufacturing assembly of a car in their countries. But working with the AFCFTA, one of the things we're trying to do is to see that those with a comparative advantage have different parts of the car in the value chain program. So yes, we are. That's the simple answer to it.
Thank you. Diana.
So we don't directly invest in the critical minerals sector. I do think it is called critical for a reason. But in some ways, you've asked for a two-sentence answer on one of the world's largest geopolitical problems, which is a bit like Andrew Mitchell with his closing. Can I just get two sentences on world peace? It needs to be solved. It requires real thought at a policy level in the key individual countries. And I do think it requires really responsible investing behind it to make sure that that is part of the value chain.
And there's quite a lot of work being done, not just by investors, but by regulators, not-for-profits, who are all looking at this particular critical mineral sector to make sure that, if I can put it, the traditional African extraction model does not apply to critical minerals.
Except that it already does. And so I think there's no consensus. And I just wonder, since you raised it, whether there is, if you think about, just transition, if you think about lots of areas, there are some broadly agreed principles, both across the continent and internationally, about how you do this. I don't see that yet in the critical minerals space. So maybe that's something from a political perspective you could be working.
So maybe I can rejig my answer to say we don't have a choice as Afreximbank or African DFIs.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. I'm sorry we've run out of time. You can see the level of sophistication, the level of determination, the access to finance, and the real passion and intelligence that exists in these two excellent organisations, financial organisations that have put it to benefit Africa. And also you can see that Invest Africa is a forum where relationships are forged and partnerships are made, even on the platform we're in the middle of doing a session. So Kanayo and Diana, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.